That's exactly how tense things will be over the next couple of days. Angelo Coppola joins us now live from Johannesburg. Daniel Rangers is live in Washington, D.C. as well. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Daniel, let's start with you. What's the latest from the White House and the Department of Commerce?
Well, in the next half hour, we're due to speak directly with the US trade representative who essentially represents President Obama on all trade issues here. But earlier, he gave a statement to Bloomberg. This was Trevor Kincaid, a spokesman. We're continuing to work with South Africa to remove the barriers that block American poultry, beef and pork. He says those outstanding issues have not yet been resolved. So in that context, it's expected that the White House may make an announcement later on, we don't know, suggesting that they will now remove AGOA benefits in the agricultural sector for South Africa. Now, I just want to point out that the impact of this would not be as great as being removed, obviously, from the entire AGOA project, given that South Africa exports several billion dollars of exports in the region of 7 or 8 billion, and agriculture accounts for around about $2 to $2.5 hundred dollars of exports. And on top of that, the tariffs that would be imposed would not be particularly high. So this would not be a crisis in US-South African trade relations, but more, I think, in the context of some very hard last-minute bargaining that's going on that affects, obviously, both countries in a way that will impact their bottom line, but is not fundamental to the relationship as a whole.
Indeed, Angelo, let's talk about those nitty-gritty details. The trade minister, you spoke to him earlier today. He's described talks having gone into extra time, but the final whistle has not been blown. The higher tariffs are not in place yet. What exactly are negotiators focusing on 6 months later?
They're focusing on a couple of issues. Firstly, there's the salmonella issue, which, according to Minister Davies, was something that was brought to the table really late. It's possible that the salmonella was only raised after the 60-day notice period was given by President Obama. So people, the negotiators are still fighting around the salmonella issues and the level of allowance. In other words, how much salmonella will South Africa accept from American imports in the chicken product specifically. And he was quite adamant that they are meeting standards that are internationally accepted. So there was debate going on between America and South Africa about salmonella and the levels that are allowable and which are healthy for consumption. But as one person put it on social media, have you heard of anyone who eats sushi chicken? So it's an outstanding issue. Then, of course, there is the other problem, and that relates, or the unresolved issue, and that relates to beef. Something that will probably be discussed in the next couple of days or so, Raman.
Indeed. Let's focus on that beef issue, Daniel. I mean, one of the main concerns here is that American beef exporters can't guarantee that their meat will not include cattle imported from either Canada or Mexico. What's a logistical challenge there?
Well, some of this is a complex mixture of problems that the US has encountered since it's introduced this law allowing country of origin labeling, and that's related to Canada and Mexico, but more to do with a US domestic consumption and the labels that are on domestic groceries here in the United States. But having said that, this is a complex issue because the supply chain can fluctuate throughout the year depending on climatic conditions. So, for example, at some times of year, the US will import calf fetuses in order to bring them up in the United States, and in some instances they may bring Canadian cattle into the United States for slaughter. I would point out that these supply chains always meet the US agricultural standards and the international standards, but nonetheless it's going to be an extra cost for the United States to be able to maintain or guarantee the supply chain to the South African market. Certainly it's possible, but I think the American view is probably that those requirements for country of origin label are a little bit onerous and are going to impose some additional costs on the US side.
Indeed. Angela, one final question to you. Let's bring this full circle. Some estimates are putting potential losses if these high tariffs do come in on agricultural produce from South Africa at anywhere between $4 to $7 million. That's about 4% of total exports to the US using 2014 figures. Isn't that, to a certain extent, an acceptable loss for South Africa if the payoff is protecting some aspects of its domestic agricultural sector?
Well, Minister Davies was suggesting that the AGOA exports are valued at around 25 billion rand. That's around $1.6 billion. And total trade into the US from South Africa is around $5 billion. So the potential job loss is where the issue is here. If for whatever reason exports are curtailed into the US because there's no duty benefit, then there's some 62,000 people's jobs who could be at risk, and this is something that South Africa isn't prepared to take a risk on. But at no point did Minister Davies mention the local agricultural sector and protection of that sector. We must also remember that the lobbying power of the poultry industry in South Africa and in the US is well known and very strong. And the South African government is also aware that workers in the chicken sector are potential ANC voters. So they've got to be careful how they play this one. Meanwhile, Agricultural Minister Zukwana said to me earlier that the AGOA negotiations have highlighted the plight of local farmers and the fact that there hasn't been any subsidization in the agricultural sector for several years now. So there may be some good that will come out of these talks for the local farming community, but it only relates to the smallholder farmers and not the commercial farmers. Raman?
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you, gentlemen, for your input. Angela Coppola live in Johannesburg and Daniel Rangers, of course, live in Washington. Now,